In March 1792, America's financial system was exactly 4 months old when it experienced its first complete collapse. A former Treasury official named William Dewar had just attempted to corner the entire stock market using borrowed money from widows, shopkeepers, and banks. His scheme crashed spectacularly, triggering the first stock market panic in a country that barely understood what stocks were. Within 8 weeks, bank runs spread across the Northeast. Securities lost 25% of their value, and the architect of this crisis died in debtor's prison. But here's what's remarkable about this story. The government's response to this 1792 panic created every financial bailout mechanism we use today. Here's what should grab our attention about this moment in our financial history. The bank that Alexander Hamilton fought so hard to create opened in December 1791. Within just 2 months, this institution had extended $2.68 million in loans. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to $80 million today, flowing through a financial system that had never handled anything close to that scale before. The bank's stock immediately became the hottest speculation in the country. Think about this scenario. You're living in a nation where most people have never heard of buying shares in anything, and suddenly there's this new institution that everyone wants to own a piece of. The First Bank of the United States represented something revolutionary, America's first attempt at centralized finance. But here's where our story gets interesting. Two men saw an opportunity that would change American finance forever. William Dewar was no ordinary speculator. This was a former assistant to the Treasury Secretary, a man with insider connections that ran straight to the heart of our government's financial operations. His partner, Alexander Macomb, was a wealthy New York merchant with deep pockets and big ambitions. Together, they hatched a plan that was as audacious as it was dangerous. Their scheme was brilliantly simple: corner the market on United States debt securities and bank stocks. Buy aggressively, create artificial demand, drive prices through the roof, then profit massively when everyone else rushed in to buy at inflated prices. Have you noticed how this playbook sounds remarkably familiar? That's because variations of this exact strategy have been attempted countless times since 1792. What made their operation particularly dangerous was the leverage. Dewar and Macomb didn't just risk their own money. They borrowed from everyone they could find: banks, wealthy merchants, and here's what should shock you. They even took money from working-class widows and small shopkeepers who had scraped together their life savings. These ordinary Americans trusted a former government official with their financial futures. The duo formed what they called the 6% Club, a syndicate of speculators whose goal was to control enough debt securities to manipulate prices upward. They borrowed hundreds of thousands of dollars, an absolutely enormous sum for 1792. To understand the scale, think about someone today borrowing $30 million to gamble on manipulating Treasury bond prices. That's essentially what they were attempting in our fledgling financial system. Pop quiz: what happens when highly leveraged speculators suddenly can't repay their massive debts? If your answer is complete financial chaos, you're about to see exactly how that plays out. Early March 1792 brought the first warning signs. Dewar and Macomb began defaulting on their loans. They simply couldn't repay their creditors. March 9th marked the beginning of panic selling as word spread through New York's small financial community. Securities prices started plunging immediately. Here's what made the situation spiral out of control so quickly. The Bank of the United States stock, which had been the crown jewel of American investing, dropped nearly 25% within weeks. On March 23rd, William Dewar was arrested for debt and thrown into debtor's prison. Meanwhile, the Bank of the United States itself made a critical decision that accelerated the crisis. They tightened credit sharply and stopped renewing loans. Think about the domino effect this created. Dewar's default triggered margin calls across the entire market. Everyone holding leverage positions was suddenly forced to sell simultaneously. These fire sales crashed prices even further, which triggered more margin calls, which forced more selling. It was a death spiral that fed on itself. Then came the bank runs. Depositors rushed to withdraw their cash as confidence evaporated. Bank reserves plummeted 34% as ordinary Americans lined up outside banks, demanding their money back. Remember, this is happening in a country where most people had never experienced anything like a bank run before. By mid-April 1792, Just 8 weeks after it began, America was experiencing its first full-blown financial panic. The system that Alexander Hamilton had designed to strengthen our young nation's finances was collapsing under the weight of speculation and debt. Let me put this in perspective for you. Our country's financial system existed for exactly 4 months before experiencing its first major crash. 4 months. That's barely enough time for people to understand how the system was supposed to work, let alone what could go wrong with it. But here's the most important part of this story, and why you should care about what happened in 1792. This panic didn't just create chaos. It forced our founding fathers to invent solutions that we still use today. The decisions made in those frantic weeks of March and April 1792 would create the blueprint for how our government handles every financial crisis, including the ones you've lived through. The crash proved something that Alexander Hamilton suspected, but had never been able to test. America needed a centralized response to financial emergencies. The question was, what should that response look like? And who should pay for it when speculators gambled with other people's money and lost? What happened next would spark a political battle between Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson that echoes in every financial crisis debate we have today. Should the government bail out the system when speculators fail, or should they be allowed to collapse as a lesson to future risk-takers? The answer to that question, developed in the spring of 1792, still shapes how our government responds to financial emergencies today. The moment William Dewar defaulted on his massive loans, America faced its first too-big-to-fail crisis. But the response to this panic would split our founding fathers into two camps that still define American politics today. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton, our Treasury Secretary, who believed the government must intervene to save the financial system. On the other side stood Thomas Jefferson, our Secretary of State, who saw any bailout as corrupt welfare for wealthy speculators. Here's what made this political battle so intense. Hamilton had spent years convincing Congress to charter the first bank of the United States against fierce opposition. Jefferson and James Madison had fought the bank from the beginning, arguing it was unconstitutional and gave too much power to the federal government. When Dewar's speculation scheme collapsed, Jefferson's faction secretly celebrated. They saw the crash as proof that Hamilton's entire financial system was fundamentally flawed. But Hamilton understood something that his critics didn't grasp yet. Dewar's debts weren't just connected to wealthy speculators. They entangled working-class widows, small shopkeepers, and banks across the Northeast. Let innocent people lose their life savings to prove a political point about speculation? Hamilton refused to allow that outcome. The mechanism for government intervention already existed, though it had never been tested. When Congress chartered the Bank of the United States, they had created something called the Sinking Fund Commission, a panel designed to manage financial crises. The commission included Vice President John Adams, Jefferson, Hamilton, Attorney General Edmund Randolph, and Chief Justice John Jay. On March 21, 1792, as panic spread through New York's financial district, Hamilton called an emergency meeting. What happened in that room would create the template for every government bailout in American history. Hamilton proposed that the federal government should buy securities in the open market to stabilize prices. Think about how revolutionary this idea was. The federal government had never intervened in financial markets before. There was no precedent, no playbook, no economic theory to guide them. Jefferson and Randolph opposed the plan immediately. They argued it was morally wrong to use taxpayer money to bail out speculators who had gambled recklessly with borrowed funds. Why should the government rescue people who had made bad financial decisions? Jefferson saw Hamilton's proposal as exactly the kind of corruption that centralized banking would inevitably create. But here's where Hamilton's political skill became crucial. He convinced the commission that they weren't just saving speculators. They were preventing the complete collapse of America's financial system. On March 26, 1792, the commission voted to authorize the first government bailout in American history. Only Jefferson dissented. The numbers tell the story of how unprecedented this intervention was. The commission authorized $100,000 in open market purchases of government securities. To understand the scale, that's roughly equivalent to $3 million today being deployed to stabilize financial markets. Hamilton's strategy was elegant in its simplicity. buy bonds to put a floor under prices and prevent total collapse. What Hamilton did next established coordination mechanisms that the Federal Reserve still uses today. He worked directly with William Seaton, the cashier of the Bank of New York, to execute the purchases strategically. Hamilton instructed the bank to accept government securities as collateral for loans and to lend at 7% instead of the usual 6%. The higher rate discouraged speculation while still providing liquidity to the system. Think about what Hamilton actually created in those desperate weeks of spring 1792. He invented the concept of lender of last resort, the idea that government must intervene when markets seize up completely. He established open market operations, where the Treasury buys securities to inject liquidity into the financial system. The Federal Reserve uses this exact same tool today. He coordinated public-private partnerships between the Treasury and banks to stabilize the entire system. But Hamilton also created something more controversial: moral hazard. By bailing out the system when speculators failed, he established the precedent that the government would rescue financial markets from their own reckless behavior. Every criticism you've heard about modern bailouts, that they reward bad decisions and encourage future speculation, started with Hamilton's intervention in 1792. The bailout worked exactly as Hamilton predicted. By May 1792, prices had stabilized, and the panic was contained within 2 months. The total intervention eventually reached over $150,000, deployed across banks throughout the Northeast. The financial system survived, credit began flowing again, and confidence slowly returned. But the political battle was just beginning. Jefferson's faction attacked Hamilton mercilessly, calling his intervention a corrupt bailout for rich speculators paid for by ordinary taxpayers. They used the panic as a weapon against Hamilton's credibility for years. Jefferson argued that by rescuing speculators from the consequences of their actions, Hamilton had proven that centralized banking inevitably led to corruption. Hamilton defended his actions by arguing that preventing total economic collapse benefited everyone, not just the speculators who had caused the crisis. When banks fail and credit disappears, he pointed out, farmers can't get loans for crops, merchants can't finance trade, and ordinary workers lose their jobs. The choice wasn't between helping speculators or helping regular people. It was between saving the entire system or letting everyone suffer for the mistakes of a few. Does this debate sound familiar? It should, because we're still having the exact same argument today. Is it corrupt to save speculators who gamble with other people's money? Or is it necessary to save the system that everyone depends on? What's remarkable is how precisely Hamilton's 1792 intervention predicted every bailout that followed. The 1907 banking panic, when J.P. Morgan coordinated private rescues that the government later backed. The 1929 crash, when the Federal Reserve tried Hamilton's open market operations, but waited too long to deploy them effectively. The 2008 financial crisis, when the Treasury and Federal Reserve used TARP, quantitative easing, and bank coordination. All tools that Hamilton invented in 1792. The political dynamics haven't changed either. Every bailout generates the same criticism Jefferson leveled in 1792. Why should taxpayers rescue Wall Street from its own greed? Every Treasury Secretary since Hamilton has given the same defense. Because letting the system collapse hurts everyone more than saving it costs. March 1792 didn't just stop America's first financial panic. It created the blueprint for how our government handles every financial crisis. Hamilton didn't just invent the bailout. He invented the government's role as the ultimate financial savior. Open market purchases to inject liquidity. Coordination between Treasury and private banks. Lender of last resort when markets freeze. And yes, moral hazard that encourages future speculation by guaranteeing rescue. The debate that split Hamilton and Jefferson in 1792 is still splitting America today. Jefferson said, bailouts corrupt the system by rewarding reckless behavior. Hamilton said, bailouts save the system by preventing total collapse. 233 years later, we're still choosing sides in the same argument our founding fathers started. William Dewar never recovered from his spectacular failure. He died in debtors. Prison in 1799, 7 years after his scheme collapsed, a broken man who had inadvertently created the financial system that still governs our lives today. But The real legacy of the 1792 panic wasn't Dewar's personal destruction. It was the institutional changes that his crisis forced into existence. The immediate regulatory response revealed how unprepared America was for financial speculation. New York's legislature scrambled to pass new rules requiring public securities auctions to be conducted under oath. They attempted to control speculation by preventing the kind of leverage manipulation schemes that Dewar had orchestrated. But here's what's crucial to understand. There was no federal regulation of banking. That would remain under state control for decades, creating a patchwork system that made future crises virtually inevitable. The Bank of the United States survived the panic and operated until its charter expired in 1811. But the crisis had proven something that even Thomas Jefferson eventually admitted. Federal coordination of financial emergencies actually worked. The bank's survival and Hamilton's successful intervention established that America needed centralized banking capabilities, even if the politics remained contentious. What's fascinating about the institutional legacy is how the crisis shaped where American finance would be centered. New York emerged as our banking capital, specifically because the Bank of New York had played such a crucial role in executing Hamilton's intervention. The relationships built during those desperate weeks of 1792 established New York as the hub of American finance, a position it has never relinquished. But the most important legacy was the precedent that government intervention in financial crises was not just acceptable, but necessary. Every Treasury Secretary since Hamilton has operated under the assumption that when the financial system faces existential threat, the government must act. That principle, born in the Panic of 1792, became the foundation of American financial policy. Here's what should grab your attention about the pattern that emerged from this crisis. The exact sequence that caused the 1792 panic has repeated itself over and over throughout American history. Credit expansion leads to speculation. Speculation leads to overleveraging. Overleveraging leads to default. Default leads to collapse. And collapse leads to government intervention. This isn't coincidence. It's how the system was designed to work. Think about the panics that followed 1792. 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, 1907, 1929, 2008. Each crisis followed the identical pattern that Dewar pioneered. Easy credit enables speculation, leverage amplifies both gains and losses, and when overleveraged speculators default, the entire system seizes up. The system creates these panics by design because it combines three inherently unstable elements: fractional reserve banking, leverage, and speculation. Banks lend out more money than they actually hold. Borrowers use that money to make leveraged bets, and when those bets go wrong simultaneously, both banks and borrowers collapse together. What 1792 established was that government bailouts were locked into this cycle permanently. Hamilton proved that letting the system collapse completely was politically unacceptable because it hurt too many innocent people. Every crisis since has featured the same Treasury intervention, following the same playbook Hamilton created. The moral hazard that Jefferson warned about became a permanent feature of American banking. Because the government won't let the system collapse completely, speculators consistently take bigger risks than they would if they knew failure meant total personal destruction. The knowledge that bailouts will come makes the next crisis more likely, not less. You can see this too connected to fail dynamic clearly in Dewar's story. His debts didn't just affect him and his wealthy partners. They entangled widows, shopkeepers, and banks throughout the Northeast. Hamilton couldn't let Dewar fail without harming thousands of innocent people who had trusted him with their savings. This exact logic drives every modern bailout decision. The credit cycles that emerge from 1792 follow an inevitable rhythm. Boom periods where credit expands and speculation flourishes, followed by bust periods where over-leveraging triggers contraction, followed by bailouts that restore confidence and begin the next cycle. This pattern was built into our financial system from the very beginning. What makes this especially relevant today is how the political dynamics haven't changed at all. Every financial crisis becomes a partisan weapon. Jefferson attacked Hamilton over the 1792 bailout. Democrats attack Republicans. Over 2008, Republicans attack Democrats over stimulus spending. The crisis becomes less about solving the financial problem and more about scoring political points. The same fundamental questions that divided Hamilton and Jefferson remain unresolved today. Should government bail out speculators who gamble recklessly with other people's money? Jefferson said absolutely not. It creates moral hazard and rewards bad behavior. Hamilton said absolutely yes, because letting them fail hurts innocent people more than saving them costs. Who should pay for these bailouts? In 1792, taxpayers funded Hamilton's $150,000 intervention. In 2008, taxpayers funded TARP and Fed programs worth trillions. The pattern is identical: private profits during the boom, public losses during the bust. How do we prevent the next crisis? Regulation consistently fails because speculation finds ways around every rule. The New York legislature's 1792 controls didn't prevent the 1819 panic. Glass-Steagall didn't prevent the 2008 crash. Dodd-Frank won't prevent the next one. The system generates crises faster than regulation can contain them. The 2008 financial crisis played out exactly like 1792, just with bigger numbers. Wall Street banks overleveraged themselves with mortgage securities the same way Dewar overleveraged himself with government bonds. When the bets went bad, the entire system seized up the same way. The government bailout followed Hamilton's template precisely: inject liquidity, coordinate with private banks, prevent total collapse. Even the political debate was identical. Critics argued that bailing out Wall Street rewarded reckless behavior and created moral hazard. Defenders argued that letting the system collapse would hurt ordinary Americans more than the bailout would cost. Jefferson versus Hamilton, 216 years later. The 1792 panic wasn't just America's first financial crisis, it was the birth certificate of American banking as we know it today. Every mechanism we recognize in modern finance originated in those 8 weeks of spring 1792. Government bailouts, lender of last resort, open market operations, moral hazard debates, political battles over intervention. All of it started with William Dewar's failed speculation scheme. Hamilton's intervention succeeded in saving the immediate crisis, but it also succeeded in proving something more lasting. Financial systems need government backstops to survive their own instability. That lesson, learned in 1792, is still the operating principle of American finance today. The same credit cycles continue, the same speculation patterns persist, the same crashes occur, the same government rescues follow, the same political debates rage. William Dewar died in prison, but his legacy lives on in every financial crisis we experience. Hamilton didn't just invent the bailout in 1792. He created the crisis cycle that defines American banking: leverage, default, collapse, intervention, recovery, repeat. The pattern was built into our system from the very beginning, and 233 years later, we're still following the script that a failed speculator and a brilliant Treasury secretary wrote in the spring of 1792.